Hey everyone, hello. Just a short video here to talk about, or audio here to talk about a particular ethical theory that is very powerful in our day. It's called utilitarianism. It is a kind of consequentialism that you've been reading about and hearing about so far in the course. Talk a little more about what is consequentialism. Consequentialism is an ethical theory that solely focuses on the consequences, the outcomes. That's what's important. The rightness or wrongness of an action depends entirely on the results. So we're not in the realm of looking at acts themselves as being good or bad, positive or negative, ethical or unethical. Rather, an action is good or bad, ethical or unethical, just in case the consequences are bad or good, etc. So we're not looking at an act itself. So to understand consequentialism, we have to think about the idea, it's contrary. Let's say that we think that murder is wrong, and it's wrong regardless of what good might come from it, if there can be such a thing. Consequentialism says we only look at the consequences, the results, not at the action itself. And so we're going to look for this course in a couple of different kinds of consequentialism. The most powerful of those these days is called utilitarianism. Oftentimes in consequentialist theories, the end goal, the what counts as a good result, is one that ends in happiness or pleasure or perhaps a sense of well-being. So they're not necessarily hedonistic understandings of the results. We're not just looking for things that bring a fleeting pleasure, but it's rather that the outcome is the best. So think, for example, right now we are doing online because of the COVID problem. In many regards, our strategy here is based upon a kind of consequentialism. That is, we think that by taking the actions we are, sheltering in place, doing education long distance, that the outcome will end up being a positive one, a good one, that doing otherwise is a worse outcome than not doing what we're doing. So that's a form of consequentialism. Our focus is on the results, hopefully ending in happiness or pleasure or well-being or all of those. The two systems that we'll take a look at are utilitarianism, that's what we'll be spending some time on today, but later we'll look at ethical egoism. Utilitarianism is the idea that you should maximize your well-being or happiness overall, and I'll talk more about some details of utilitarianism. Ethical egoism is the idea that you have a duty to maximize your well-being only for yourself. That is, you count more than others. In utilitarianism, everyone counts as one. Your happiness, your good, your well-being is just as valuable as mine, but we only count as one. So in utilitarianism, we're going to add up the well-being, the happiness of each individual. And so the goal will be to achieve the greatest happiness or the greatest pleasure or the greatest well-being for the greatest number. Whereas ethical egoism is not concerned with the group or the collective. It's only concerned with the individual. You count more than anyone else in ethical egoism, if that's your desire. So let's focus on utilitarianism. Its most strident defender and originator was named Jeremy Bentham. He developed the idea, and it was later picked up by John Stuart Mill. Mill is known in American political philosophy for writing a document called On Liberty. So he's very influential in modern understandings of government and human freedom, but he was also quite a capable ethicist, and he, along with Bentham, developed the idea called utilitarianism. Its hope was that moral judgments could be scientifically calculated. If you take a look at the dates of these two gentlemen, you can see that they were living at a time when the scientific age was really taking off. Science was beginning to prove itself in industry, in bringing about better living conditions for people and to be able to produce large goods, move people around the country very quickly, say on locomotives. Shipping was being improved. Well, they hoped to apply that same kind of scientific success to moral judgments. They considered that the problem with ethics up until the time that they existed was that it hadn't had scientific principles applied to it. So they hope to be able to come up with a kind of objective calculus by which we can do ethics and know what the right course of action is. So as I mentioned earlier, utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. It's not the only form, but it probably is the most popular form today. It's practiced very widely. It's defended very widely. So utilitarianism is a very powerful consequentialist understanding of ethics. So what are some basic building blocks of utilitarianism? Let's take a look at that. The first and basic building block of utilitarian ethics is the so-called greatest happiness principle. Now, the greatest happiness principle is the idea that it's the fundamental principle of all morality. It's interesting, Bentham and Mill thought their scientific calculus was new. They thought that they were coming up with a kind of formula by which we can tell what is ethical. What they didn't think they were doing was creating a new ethical theory, because they considered that all ethics that had been worth its weight up until the time they were writing had always used this greatest happiness principle. In other words, they're saying, here's what everyone has always been doing all along. We are just going to formalize it and create a scientific way of describing it. And so they think that throughout time, the fundamental principle of all morality has been the greatest happiness principle. The greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's what we're trying. I mean, imagine Sparta is going to invade Athens, or they're going to have a fight with the Persians. Bentham and Mill would say that the reason why any country might go into war is because they think the results will be positive, either in defending oneself, that is, defense and the hope of victory is better than defeat, or in expanding one's territory. We are better off sacrificing lives so that we can gain new ground, a new place to live, maybe new treasure. So the idea is that we all do this kind of cost-benefit analysis, and that cost-benefit is focused upon the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. That's called the greatest happiness principle. Good acts, then, are those that promote happiness or bring about the absence of pain. Bad acts, then, are those that have bad results. Remember, we're not focused on the act itself. It's intrinsically either good or bad. Or it's not, we're not on intrinsically motivated. It's all about the results. Bad acts, then, are those that promote pain and the privation of pleasure. So if we wanted to invade another country, Sparta wants to invade Athens, but they figure that they will lose the battle, well, that will promote a whole lot of pain, and people won't be able to have the kind of pleasure that they would like to have. And so you might decide not to invade in that case. But invading itself is neither good nor bad. It's just whether it results in the greatest good for the greatest number. The standard is the greatest amount of happiness overall for everyone. This is where this view distinguishes itself from ethical egoism. The greatest amount of happiness for all. The standard is not your happiness or my happiness, but rather the happiness of everyone overall. So back to our current crisis that we're in. The argument that sheltering in place, perhaps curtailing our economy, people having to no longer work, maybe no longer get a check for a while, the social division that might arise by our being isolated from one another. If in fact this is a good act, according to utilitarianism, then it will have a positive result. If it ends up being not good in the end, that we look back and we say we shouldn't have done that, well then this was a bad act that we're doing right now. Notice we have to wait for the results to come out before we can know whether an act is good or bad. Only results count, and the results to count according to utilitarianism are the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, a little more about John Stuart Mill. He thought happiness was central. Now, in his understanding of things, happiness is not just simply pleasure, physical pleasure. It's not anything that happens to bring you happiness, but rather it's a kind of um, a pleasure of well-being is the idea. And I'll say more about this in a moment. But for Mill, happiness was central to what it means to be an ethical person. We should be striving for our happiness, but not just happiness of any kind. It's a particular kind. He says, for example, in a famous quotation, that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. As you might imagine, Mill's utilitarianism was attacked by people who said, oh, it's just hedonistic, it's just focused on physical pleasure. That you think ethics is all about just giving people what they want to make them happy from time to time and not what is best for them. And so they called it a pig morality. That is, a pig is happy as long as he has some mud and some nasty food to eat. But Mill responded by saying, no, it is better. Human beings are genuinely happier. They're better off if they are dissatisfied than if they are like pigs that are satisfied. In other words, what he seems to be getting at here is that there are certain kinds of pleasures that are not good for human beings to have. And so he thought that we need to distinguish between various kinds of pleasures, what he called higher and lower pleasures. And he's instead, rather than focusing upon the quantity of pleasures, that would be a pig morality, he focused instead on the quality of the pleasures. So, for example, some pleasures that he put on the lower rank are things like food, lust for death. Many people might say, well, it gives people pleasure to go and watch the Roman games where Christians and others would sacrifice for the entertainment and pleasure of those who were viewing. That as long as remember, we're not focused on intrinsic things, if that kind of sport gives people pleasure, what does it matter? It's pleasure is pleasure. If Mill were living today, he might look at Ultimate Fighting Championships or something like that and say that's not the kind of pleasure he's talking about. He called those kinds of pleasures animal pleasures. They are lower kinds of pleasures, and they're not as good in terms of the higher pleasures. What are some higher pleasures then? Well, for Mill, it was things like poetry, studying philosophy, you'll be happy to know. Good wine, he considered, a very good food. Notice the focus here is on the quality of the pleasures and not on the quantity of the pleasures. That seems to have been where he was being attacked when people claimed that his morality was merely a pig morality. So we have to look at the quantity of the pleasures. Now, as you might anticipate, his distinction between quality and quantity of pleasures sounds rather elitist. And indeed, he was a bit of an elitist in terms of his understanding of utilitarianism. But I think you can see that it may not be good for human beings simply to have pleasures of any kind. There are certain pleasures that are better than others. Playing a video game probably, I think, for most people, would not give us as much pleasure as visiting with our very best friend. We can look at those pleasures and we think about the difference between them, and the difference is not in terms of one gives more pleasure and one gives less pleasure, but rather there's a different kind of pleasure that comes from these higher activities like friendship or contemplation, studying, learning. These are better pleasures than, say, eating pork rinds or something like this. At least that's what Mill might say. But he thinks we can distinguish these, and that avoids the charge of it merely being a kind of pig morality. He also insisted that morality is about the greatest happiness in this now refined way, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Again, your happiness doesn't count more than mine, mine doesn't count more than yours, Everyone counts as one, and so as a society, we need to be making decisions that are good for all of us overall, and not focusing on just a select group or one individual or something like that. So it's the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And then, of course, the goal of ethics, of all ethical acts, is happiness. That's what we're really about, he says. The focus of ethics is happiness, not doing the right thing, because the right thing is whatever results in happiness. The goal of ethics, then, is, notice, is not to make people good, but to make them happy. So Mill, as you're going to see, disagrees with Kant, and he'll disagree with another philosopher. We'll look at Aristotle on this particular point. For Kant, the ultimate goal of ethics is to be a good person, and I'll have more to say about that later. But for Mill, he is a consequentialist and a utilitarian, which means the greatest good for the greatest number, and so he was focused on the results of the action and not how they developed the character or made the person better. One of the problems with utilitarianism is the idea, this whole understanding of ethics. Notice, for Mill, ethical acts are those that result in happiness. But if you think about some things you've experienced in your life when you've done a good act, did you do it so that you could be happy? This may have happened to you. It's happened to me once or twice. But you're driving down 35 and you see their car is broken down on the side of the road, and clearly they're having a challenge changing a tire. There was a time I lived in Minneapolis. It was really cold night. I was driving home from my midnight shift at the post office, and it must have been in the teens below zero, or in the teens at any rate. It was really quite cold. And I saw on my way home, it was about 2 a.m., a car broken down and a couple of young people trying to change a tire. So I pulled over to the side, got out, helped them change the tire quickly. They thanked me and everything was fine. They got back in the car. And after that was over, I kind of felt good that I had helped them. I'm sure you've done things like that before. Now think about this from a utilitarian perspective. Was that a good act? Mill would say, I think it was. It brought pleasure to those young people. They were able to get out of the pain of the cold. It did inflict the pain on me, but my pain was no worse than theirs. There were two of them, only one of me, so they were able to wait in the car. I was able to do it more quickly than they could, because I knew what I was doing, and they were unfamiliar with changing a tire in the snow. And so it was it ended up with the greater pleasure for others overall. And so it would fit into the utilitarian calculus. Here's the problem, though, with Mill's understanding of things, I think, with utilitarianism. Notice the goal of doing the act is happiness. But when I was thinking about doing that act, I wasn't thinking about happiness at all. I would just simply think it's the right thing to do, to change a tire. Happiness does not make an act good. Oftentimes, when we perform acts, we do them, and they are good acts, and because we do them, then we're happy. But we don't use happiness typically as a reason for doing our actions. If you quickly rescue a child from street traffic, you did it not so that you could feel happy, but you feel happy because you did it. So Kant, for example, will argue against Mill that this is the problem, that utilitarians have ethics wrong. They think of ethics in terms of its results rather than in terms of the actions themselves. Now, there are two very common forms of utilitarianism that are still around today. So let's unpack those two types of utilitarianism we find today. One is called act utilitarianism. This is where we simply take the principle of utility, and remember the principle of utility is the greatest good for the greatest number, and we apply that to each individual action. So we don't ask things like, is murder wrong? Is lying wrong? Is changing a tire on a cold evening a good thing to do? Instead, we simply ask, is this particular instance of murder or lying or changing a tire a good or bad act? So it's not about kinds of actions. The principle of utility is applied in each case. So, for example, we have some problems with this view. Is one, as Kant will say, and you'll read about him, is how can we be certain of the consequences of our actions? How do you know if an act is good because it has good results? Let's imagine that scenario where I was changing the tire in that cold evening in Minnesota. Let's say I had pulled off to the side of the road to change the tire and had gone about doing so, and then the people there had mugged me and left me on the side of the road. Well, that ended, and the result of that act was not positive at all. Um, so it would seem that, notice, since a good act is good based upon its consequences, in this case, the consequences were bad. So my pulling over was a bad act. You see that? So the problem here is how can you be certain of the consequences whenever we act? And then the other problem is how can we really do this calculus? Can we add up pleasure and pain in this way? Can I assume that the pleasure, the happiness experienced by those two people I helped can be calculated with my own happiness, and we can somehow come out with a result and know that an act was good or bad? Can we really do the calculus? And then probably the biggest problem for act utilitarianism is this objectionable consequence called SAM. SAM's pretty famous in utilitarianism, but here's how it works. So Sam he's a very healthy young man. He is visiting his old grandmother in the hospital. She's about to die. She's got a terminal illness. Sam has no living relatives. He's kind of a loner. He's really healthy. It just so happens that there are 4 other people in that hospital who are all a perfect match for Sam's organs, his heart, his lungs, his liver, etc. And if we could just harvest those from him, we would allow 4 other people to survive. So notice, how would an act utilitarian approach this problem? You've got, should we chloroform Sam, knock him out, harvest his organs that will result in his death, but we'd be able to save 4 people. So the problem here, of course, is that if we simply do the calculus, the happiness of 4 surviving people, Sam is not going to be missed. It's only 1 death, 1 versus 4. 4 wins. We should harvest Sam's organs. And so you can see that that's a problem. If notice the rightness or wrongness of the act, we don't answer this by saying, well, that would be wrong to kill Sam. What's right or wrong is based upon the results, not the act itself. So for this reason, many people are not act utilitarians these days. They realize that this can lead to some objectionable consequences. And so the more common kind of utilitarianism is the one we can talk about now. And that kind of utilitarianism is called rule utilitarianism. So the idea here is we're not putting the principle of utility on any one particular action. We don't ask, should we harvest Sam's organs? It's rather we develop general rules that guide our conduct. So a rule utilitarian is going to say, what kinds of actions in general lead to the greatest good for the greatest number? So let's go back to Sam. How would a rule utilitarian handle this? Well, a rule utilitarian would say, well, listen, if we are going to harvest people's organs because they're needed against their will, there might be some bad consequences to that if we practice it all the time. Imagine if you were to go to the hospital and you knew that doctors every once in a while would just chloroform people in the elevator and harvest their organs to help their patients because they're act utilitarians. Well, you probably wouldn't go to the hospital. You would probably take security guards with you, all kinds. You can see how it upsets society. And so isn't it better, says the utilitarian, that we just adopt a rule that says, let's not kill people like Sam. Let's not kill people at all. Let's have a rule that says no murder. And so notice, because if we adopt the rule that says no murder, in general, that leads to a better outcome for everybody. So notice, we're going to prohibit murder under rule utilitarianism, not because murder is wrong, but because if we did murder and allow it from time to time, it would lead to worse consequences than if we outlawed it. So the principle of utility is used to determine general rules of conduct, not in each specific act. So morality then is following the rules which would most likely produce the most happiness for all, overall, for everyone. And so, of course, what this looks like in the end is something like the Ten Commandments. Don't murder, don't lie, don't steal, those kinds of things. Not because stealing or murder or lying are wrong in themselves, but because if we were to allow those kinds of things in all instances, it would lead to greater bad than greater good. So it's only focused on the consequences. Now, you might think that this solves Act Utilitarian's problems. With regard to Sam, Rule Utilitarianism would say, well, yes, in this instance, it would be a good act for me to harvest Sam's organs and save 4 other people. But if I did that, it would violate the general rule, and the general rule is best followed. So that's how it would work. Now, there are problems for rule utilitarianism, though. And what if we adopt a rule that says things like, let's enslave all people of a certain ethnicity or a certain race or a certain gender? Would that be wrong? Now, you might be thinking, well, that's a violation of their human rights, a violation of their human dignity. That's not the way utilitarianism thinks. People are not inherently dignified or inherently protected. They don't have inherent rights. Um, the idea of the problem here is that you could, under rule utilitarianism, develop a society in which we said, you know, we think it's going to be better overall if we enslaved all left-handed people and make them our chattel property. That would lead to the greatest good for the greatest number if all left-handed people were the slaves of right-handed people. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And we can think, and then we just do the calculus. And if it came out that in fact it would end in greater happiness for the greater number, then we should do it. Notice, this is the problem with utilitarianism. It doesn't just present options. You should do the thing that brings about the greatest good for the greatest number. And so in this case, if enslaving all left-handed people resulted in the greater good for the greater number, then we should do it, even under rule utilitarianism. And the rule would be something like, it's okay to enslave left-handed people. You get the idea. So that's one of the objections to rule utilitarianism is it can end up in these real problems. Nevertheless, as I said, rule utilitarianism is quite popular these days. There are many prominent people who are rule utilitarians, and they think that ethics is not about human rights or the inherent dignity of people or simply following commands given by God or looking at individual actions. Rather, we look at the consequences, the result of those actions. And if they end up in the greatest good for the greatest number, it obligates us to do those actions. Okay, so that's a quick survey of utilitarianism. We'll look at some other ethical systems on our next show. Bye-bye.